Let her go. 2 words. That was all Dominic Reyes said. No warning, no explanation, no second chance offered. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The man gripping the little girl's wrist felt it anyway, the specific bone-deep cold of a command that wasn't a request. But 30 seconds earlier, none of this had started with words. It had started with a fist. A child's fist no bigger than a peach, raised for exactly 2 seconds in a crowd of strangers. Thumb folded in, eyes locked on his. A silent scream that only one man on that entire block understood. And that man did not look away. If this story moves you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this little girl's signal has traveled. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, and by 6 it hadn't let up. It came down in heavy, uneven sheets across Manhattan's Lower West Side, the kind of rain that drove people indoors and emptied the sidewalks fast. Umbrellas turned inside out. Taxi horns blared. Steam rose from the grates beneath people's feet like the city itself was exhaling. Dominic Reyes stepped out of his black Escalade in at 6:17 p.m. He didn't rush. He never rushed. His driver held the door. His head of security, a man named Carver, moved 2 steps behind him with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years learning exactly how much space to give a man like Dominic without crowding him. 2 more men fanned out on either side, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, just quietly, the way shadows move. Dominic buttoned the top button of his coat and scanned the block. It was a habit, not paranoia. Professionals didn't call it paranoia. They called it awareness. Every time he stepped out of a vehicle, his eyes swept left, then right, then across the street, then back. Not because he expected a threat, because men who stopped expecting threats were the men who ended up in the news. He was supposed to be walking into the Marcello building for a 7 o'clock meeting, a real estate negotiation, the kind that involved numbers nobody talked about out loud. He had 12 minutes to spare, and he planned to use all of them, standing on the sidewalk, finishing the last of the coffee his assistant had handed him before they left. That was when he saw the girl. She was small, maybe 8 years old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell with the rain in the distance. She wore a bright yellow dress beneath a clear plastic rain poncho that was slightly too big for her, the hem dragging against her ankles. She had dark hair plastered to the sides of her face. She was moving fast, not because she wanted to, but because someone was making her move fast. The man beside her had her wrist, not her hand. Her wrist. There's a difference, and Dominic knew it the moment he saw it. A father holding his daughter's hand in the rain walks with her. His grip adjusts to hers. His pace matches hers or slows for her. The child leans in or swings her arm or pulls toward a puddle. That's what normal looks like. This wasn't normal. The man, mid-30s, heavy-set, wearing a dark hoodie with the drawstrings pulled tight around his face, was half a step ahead of the girl, his arm extended back toward her, pulling rather than guiding. His head was down. He wasn't talking to her. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes moved the way guilty eyes always move, scanning exits, not faces. Dominic's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, and then the girl looked up. She wasn't looking for anyone specific. Dominic understood that later when he had time to think about it. She wasn't looking for him. She was just looking the desperate, sweeping kind of looking that children do when they're hoping that anyone in the whole world will notice that something is wrong. Their eyes met. Hers were dark brown, wide open, and absolutely terrified. For a fraction of a second, neither of them moved. And then she did it. It was small, almost imperceptible. She raised her right hand just slightly, not enough to draw the man's attention, not a wave, not a gesture, and she folded her thumb into her palm, curled her 4 fingers down around it, and held her fist closed. 2 seconds, maybe less. Then her hand dropped. Dominic's blood went cold. He knew that signal. He had been made to learn it years ago by a woman he respected more than anyone alive. His mother's neighbor, a retired school counselor named Mrs. Alvarez, who had insisted that every child in their building learn it after a girl 3 blocks over went missing one summer. It was called the signal for help, designed specifically for moments when a person couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't draw attention without making things worse. Thumb inside the fist. It meant I am in danger. I need help. Please don't ignore me. He had never seen a child use it in real life until that moment. His coffee hit the sidewalk. Carver, His voice was low, flat, and completely controlled. The kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to fill a room. Carver was already beside him. I see her. Don't lose them. Don't touch him yet. Stay back. Understood. Dominic didn't run. Running caused scenes. Scenes caused complications. He walked at a pace that was faster than it looked, cutting through the pedestrian traffic on the sidewalk with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades moving through crowds without being noticed when he didn't want to be. Carver broke off with one of the other men keeping distance, tracking the yellow dress through the crowd. The man in the hoodie was moving with purpose now. He made a left turn off the main avenue and immediately the foot traffic thinned. Residential buildings on either side, fewer lights, the kind of block where at 6:20 p.m. in the rain nobody was standing around. Nobody except the people following him. Dominic rounded the corner 45 seconds behind them and stopped. The man had paused halfway down the block. He was crouched down in front of the girl, both hands on her shoulders, talking to her. His voice was too low to carry, but his posture, the forward lean, the tight grip wasn't comfort. It was control. It was warning. The girl stood rigid. Her arms were at her sides. She wasn't crying, not visibly. She was doing something harder than crying. She was enduring. Waiting. The way small people learn to wait when they've understood that screaming won't help. Dominic felt something shift in his chest. He had dealt with dangerous men his entire adult life. He had sat across tables from people who had done things that would make most people's skin crawl. He had negotiated in rooms where the threat of violence was as present as the furniture. None of it had ever made him feel quite like this specific simmering kind of fury that had no performance in it. Just heat. He took out his phone and texted Carver, blocked the far end. Nobody gets through. Carver's response came back in 4 seconds. Done. Then Dominic walked forward. The man in the hoodie heard footsteps and stood up straight, turning around. His face, what was visible beneath the drawstring hood, was angular, unshaven, with a small tattoo beneath his left ear. His eyes did the guilty sweep again, up sideways behind him, landing on Dominic. For a moment, nobody said anything. The girl turned her head. When she saw Dominic, something happened in her face that he hadn't expected. Not relief, not yet. Something more complicated than that. A kind of recognition. Like she was calculating whether he was real or whether she was about to be disappointed by an adult for the second time that day. Hey, the man in the hoodie straightened up. His voice was gruff, defensive, before a single accusation had been made. What do you want? Dominic stopped about 8 feet away. He looked at the man for a long moment without answering. Then he looked at the girl. Hey, sweetheart, he said. His voice was different now, quieter. What's your name? The man stepped slightly in front of the girl, not protective, blocking. She's my daughter. Mind your business. Dominic looked at him again. I didn't ask you. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the man in the hoodie seemed to realize something was different about this situation. This wasn't a nosy stranger. This wasn't someone he could brush off with an explanation. Something in Dominic's stillness communicated what words hadn't, that this man was not afraid of him. Not even a little. The girl spoke first. Emma. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady, like she'd made a decision. My name is Emma. Hi, Emma, Dominic said. He didn't crouch down yet, didn't make any move that would spook the man. Are you okay? Emma opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes moved to the man beside her, then back to Dominic. Then she did something that took more courage than most adults could manage under pressure. She shook her head, just once, just barely, but clearly. She said she's fine. The man grabbed Emma's wrist again, stepping back. We're leaving. No. Dominic's voice didn't rise, didn't harden, didn't shift in any dramatic way. He just said the word the way you'd say no to a waiter who brought the wrong order, calm, certain, finished. You're not. The man laughed. It was a short, sharp, nervous sound. You think you can stop me? Who do you think you are? Dominic tilted his head just slightly. Somebody who's going to count to 3. Count to 3. The man stepped forward, letting go of Emma to jab a finger toward Dominic's chest. You got any idea what you're getting into? 1, Dominic said. The man blinked. Something in his voice apparently communicated that this wasn't theater. Listen to me, pal. 2. The man turned to his left. The mouth of the alley that connected to the next block, his exit, was 20 feet away. He took one step toward it. Carver stepped out of the shadows at the alley entrance. He was 6'3", 240 pounds, and he stood with his hands at his sides in a way that left no ambiguity about what he was prepared to do. The man spun the other direction. The second bodyguard was behind him. The man in the hoodie turned back to Dominic. His face had changed. The aggression was still there, but underneath it now was something more honest fear. "You've got no right." 3. Dominic said it quietly. Then he walked toward the man, not fast, not aggressive, just forward with absolute certainty, as if the concept of the man being in his way had simply not occurred to him as a possibility. The man backed up until his shoulder hit the building wall. Emma stepped sideways away from him, and Dominic moved to stand between the two of them without making a production of it. He was just suddenly there, between her and the man who'd had her wrist. "My daughter, stop." Dominic looked at him with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something quieter and significantly more dangerous, absolute settled certainty. "She's not your daughter, and we both know it, so let's stop wasting each other's time." The man's jaw worked. His eyes moved around the exits, Carver, the second guard, back to Dominic, and found no option that looked promising. Dominic pulled out his phone. "What are you doing?" the man asked. His voice had dropped. Something in it cracked slightly like old wood under too much weight. "Calling Detective Jacobs." Dominic didn't look up from the screen. "NYPD, he handles cases like this. He's very good at his job." You're calling the cops?" The man actually sounded surprised, which told Dominic something. He had expected something else, something less official, something that wouldn't result in paperwork or a trial. "I am." Dominic put the phone to his ear. "Because you're going to answer for this the right way, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, where Emma here gets to stand up and tell exactly what happened today." Emma made a small sound, not a cry, more like a breath released after being held too long. The man against the wall made one more attempt. "Listen to me again. Listen to me. I know who you are. I know who you are, Reyes. You don't want the police involved in your business. Trust me. You make one call and you bring attention to yourself." Dominic lowered the phone for a moment. He looked at the man with genuine curiosity, the way you might look at something unexpected found on the sidewalk. "You think," Dominic said slowly, "that threatening me right now is your best move?" The man said nothing. "With my people on both sides of you." A pause. "Dawn. While you're holding a child you kidnapped off a playground." Silence. "Interesting strategy," Dominic said. Then he put the phone back to his ear. The call connected in 2 rings. "Jacobs, it's Reyes." He gave the street and address precise and clean. "I've got a man here. He took a little girl from a playground. She's safe. He's not going anywhere." A pause, listening. "Yeah, bring a unit. No rush, he'll be right here when you arrive." He ended the call and put the phone in his coat pocket. Then he turned to Emma. She was standing about 3 feet behind him, her arms wrapped around herself, the oversized rain poncho hanging off one shoulder. She was looking at him the way children look at things they haven't decided yet whether to trust. Dominic crouched down, slowly, deliberately, putting himself at her eye level so she wasn't looking up at him, wasn't reminded of every tall person who had power over her. "You're safe now," he said. It wasn't said with warmth he'd manufactured for the moment. It was stated flatly and with conviction, the way he stated things he intended to make true. "Do you understand me? You're safe." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "You saw it," she said quietly. "The signal." "I did. My teacher taught it to us." Her voice was small, but it wasn't shaking anymore. "She said if we ever couldn't say the words, we should use the signal. She said someone would see it." Dominic held her gaze. She was right. Emma blinked. Then her face did something complicated, relief and exhaustion, and something that might have been the very beginning of tears all at once. "I did it twice," she said, "in the street. I looked at you and I did it twice because I wasn't sure if once was enough." Something moved in Dominic's chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't try to find one. "Once was enough," he said. Behind him, the man against the wall had gone completely quiet, whether it was Carver's proximity or the realization that his situation had become irreversible. The fight had gone out of him entirely. He stood with his back to the building, shoulders drawn in, looking at the ground. He said he knew my mom, Emma said. Her voice dropped again. That's what he told me at the playground. He said she sent him to pick me up because she got stuck at work. She looked down at her shoes. I almost believed him. I almost went. Dominic watched her face. But you didn't. She shook her head. Something felt wrong. He didn't know her name. When I asked him to say her name, he guessed. He said, Maria, and my mom's name isn't Maria. She paused. That's when I started looking for someone to tell. That was smart, Dominic said. That was very smart, Emma. She looked up at him. I looked at a lot of people before I looked at you. He nodded. He understood. In a crowd, people look away. They rationalize. They assume someone else will handle it. They keep walking because they have somewhere to be, or because they're afraid of being wrong, or because the human tendency to not get involved is as old and persistent as hunger. I looked at your eyes, Emma said, and you didn't look away. Dominic was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I didn't. The sirens became audible at 6:41 p.m., a distant wail growing louder as two patrol cars turned onto the block, their lights cutting blue and red patterns across the wet pavement. Dominic stood. He moved to stand a few feet from Emma, not over her, just nearby. Present, in a way that said nothing else is getting to you tonight. Emma looked at the approaching lights. Her hands were still folded in front of her, but she'd stopped hugging herself. She stood straighter. The man in the hoodie was taken into custody without incident. He didn't struggle, didn't argue. He said nothing, in fact, not a word, as the officers cuffed him and walked him toward the patrol car. He didn't look at Emma. He didn't look at Dominic. Detective Jacobs arrived 4 minutes later in an unmarked sedan. He was a compact man in his late 50s, with a permanently tired face and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who slept at his desk more often than he should. He'd worked with Dominic before in the ambiguous, carefully maintained way that law enforcement sometimes works with people who operate in spaces that aren't quite legal and aren't quite illegal and are absolutely necessary to know. Reyes, Jacobs said, stopping beside him. Jacobs. Jacobs looked at Emma, then at the patrol car where the suspect was being processed, then back at Dominic. You want to tell me how you ended up in the middle of this? I was on my way to a meeting. Dominic gestured down the block in the general direction of the Marcello building, which now seemed like something from a different chapter of the evening. She signaled. I saw it. Jacobs looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had heard many things in his career and had learned to accept that some of them couldn't be fully categorized. The signal, Jacobs repeated. The signal. The detective exhaled. All right. He turned to Emma. His voice shifted not into the false overbright register that adults sometimes use with children, but into something gentler and more honest. Emma, my name is Detective Jacobs. Can I talk to you for a little bit? Emma glanced once at Dominic. He gave her a small single nod. She looked back at Jacobs. Okay, she said. As Jacobs led Emma toward a female officer who had arrived and was crouching down to speak with her, Carver appeared at Dominic's shoulder. Meeting started 10 minutes ago, Carver said, his voice neutral. I know. Do you want me to cancel it? Dominic watched Emma from across the block. She was talking to the officer now, and while her posture was still tight, with the residue of fear, her face had changed. Some of the blankness had gone out of it. She was present again. She was in her own body again. Tell them something came up. Carver looked at him, said nothing. Go ahead, Carver. Yes, sir. Dominic stood on that block for another 40 minutes. He didn't need to. Jacobs had the situation handled. Emma was with trained officers, and there was nothing that required his presence. He had no legal obligation, no professional reason, no practical use to anyone at that point. He stood there anyway. At some point, Emma's mother arrived, a woman in her mid-30s named Claire, still in her nurse's scrubs, who had been reached by phone and had driven across 2 boroughs in under 20 minutes, which told you something about how fast a person can move when they receive a certain kind of phone call. She dropped to her knees on the wet pavement and pulled Emma into her arms, and neither of them said anything audible for a long moment. They just held on. Dominic looked away. It felt like something that wasn't meant for his eyes. Jacobs reappeared beside him. The perp's name is Gary Foltz, Jacobs said, voice low. He's in the system. 2 priors, one for attempted luring, one for harassment involving a minor. Both times the charges were reduced. Both times he walked. The detective paused. Not this time. Dominic said nothing. We're going to find out if he had the girl under surveillance, how long he'd been watching her. Jacobs looked across to where Claire was still holding Emma. We got lucky tonight. She got lucky, Dominic said. She did the right thing. Someone just had to not look away. Jacobs was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, there's going to be some press on this. People are going to ask questions about your involvement. I know. You want to get ahead of it. Put together a statement. No. Reyes. I don't need a statement, Jacobs. Dominic turned his coat collar up against the rain. She's safe, that's a statement. The detective looked at him for another moment, then nodded once and walked back toward his team. Dominic started toward his car. He was 3 steps away when he heard a small voice say his name, not his first name, not his last name, just Mr. He stopped. Emma had pulled free from her mother just slightly. She was looking at him from across the block, standing in the spill of a streetlight, her yellow dress soaked through and her dark hair hanging flat against her face. She looked like exactly what she was, an 8-year-old girl at the end of an absolutely terrifying day. She raised her right hand, not the signal, not the distress signal. Something else. A wave. Small, deliberate. The kind a child gives a person they want to remember. Dominic looked at her for a moment. Then he raised his hand in return. Just once, just briefly. He got in the car. He didn't speak for the entire ride. Carver knew better than to ask. The city moved past the windows in streaks of wet light, and Dominic sat in the back of the Escalade and stared at nothing in particular and thought about a little girl in a yellow dress who had looked at a crowd full of people and found the one who wouldn't look away. He thought about how close it had come, how many people had walked past her before his eyes met hers, how the distance between safety and something unthinkable had been a single signal, a single pair of eyes, a single decision not to keep walking. How easy it would have been to keep walking. He didn't regret staying. He didn't think he would. Dominic didn't sleep that night. He told himself it was the meeting he'd canceled $3 million in real estate negotiations pushed to Thursdays because he'd stood on a wet sidewalk for 40 minutes watching a little girl get reunited with her mother. He told himself it was the rain or the late coffee or the low-grade restlessness that sometimes followed high-tension situations. He lay in bed in his penthouse apartment with the city spread out below him and stared at the ceiling and knew with the same certainty he applied to everything else that he was lying to himself. It was Emma. Not just what had happened to her, he had seen worse things happen to people and slept fine afterward, which was its own kind of indictment. He didn't spend time examining. It was the signal. The way she'd raised that small hand, folded her thumb into her palm and held it for exactly long enough to be seen. The calculation in it. The courage. An 8-year-old who, in the middle of being terrified, had remembered what her teacher told her and had trusted against every reason not to, that it would work. He got up at 3 a.m. and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and stood at the window and thought about Gary Foltz. 2 priors. 2 reduced charges. 2 times a man with a documented history of targeting children had walked out of a courthouse and gone back to his life. And somewhere in the years between those 2 incidents, he had found Emma, had watched her, had learned her routine, her school, her playground, the time her mother's shift ended, and the 20-minute window when Emma walked home with her neighbor's kid, and sometimes, just sometimes, that kid's mom ran late and Emma stood outside the school gate alone. How long had he been watching her before today? A week, a month more. Dominic set the glass down on the windowsill without finishing it. He picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 4 months. It rang twice. Do you know what time it is? The voice on the other end was male, sharp, and entirely unsurprised. I need information on a Gary Foltz, Dominic said. NYPD has him in custody, arrested tonight for attempted abduction of a minor. I want to know everything the department isn't going to put in the public record. Who he knows, who he's worked with. Whether this was the first time he targeted this specific child or whether there's a pattern. A pause. I want it by morning. Silence on the other end. Then, this a personal thing or a business thing? Dominic looked out at the city. Personal. Another silence. Longer this time. The man on the other end, whose name Dominic never used over the phone, seemed to be reassessing something. Finally, he said 8 a.m. 7. 7:30. Fine. He ended the call, put the phone face down on the windowsill, watched a plane blink slowly across the sky above the Hudson, and thought about a yellow dress in the rain. He was dressed and at his desk by 6. The information arrived at 7:22, delivered not by phone but by a single encrypted email that contained 6 attached files and a handwritten note at the top that said simply, "You're not going to like this." He didn't. Gary Foltz was 41 years old. He had grown up in Queens, done 2 years at a community college, never finished, bounced between warehouse jobs and delivery routes for the better part of his adult life. The 2 prior charges Jacobs had mentioned were only the documented surface. Beneath that surface, in the channels that official records didn't reach, there was significantly more. Forum accounts, encrypted message threads, fragments of which had been recovered in a previous investigation that had ultimately gone nowhere because the prosecutor couldn't make the charge stick without a cooperating witness, who then recanted. 3 other children whose names appeared in connection with Foltz's known movements over the past 2 years, though nothing had ever been proven. 3 other children. Dominic read the files twice. Then he sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, which was the amount of time he allowed himself to feel the kind of anger that couldn't be used productively before it had to be set aside and converted into something functional. Then he picked up the phone and called Jacobs. It was 7:41 in the morning. Jacobs answered on the second ring and sounded like a man who hadn't slept either. "Reyes, you're calling early." "I'm sending you something," Dominic said. "You're not going to be able to use all of it in court, but enough of it is cross-referenceable with things you already have access to that it gives you a thread to pull." He paused. "There are 3 other names in there. Children, his prior targets. One of them might be willing to talk now if someone asked the right way." A long pause from Jacob's end. "Then carefully, where did you get this?" "I got it," Dominic said, "from someone who knows things. That's all I can tell you. The question isn't where it came from. The question is whether you're going to use it." He could hear Jacob's breathing. The particular kind of breathing a principled man does when he's deciding how far his principles will bend. "Send it," Jacob said finally. Dominic sent it. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. The city was fully awake now, noise drifting up from 32 floors below. He thought about Emma waking up this morning, whether she'd slept, whether she'd had nightmares, whether she had woken up in her own bed and for one blissful half-second, before remembering, thought it had all been a dream, and then remembered it hadn't. He thought about Claire, her mother, sitting on the edge of Emma's bed watching her daughter sleep. He thought about how many nights that woman was about to spend doing exactly that. The media found the story by 10 a.m. He knew they would. He had known since the moment Jacob said the word press on that rainy block the night before. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the velocity. By noon, it was on 4 local news sites. By 2 o'clock, the cable networks had picked it up. By 4, it was national. Mafia boss saves girl from predator on Manhattan Street. That was the most common version of the headline. Some outlets were more charitable. Some were considerably less. One ran with crime lord intervenes in child abduction publicity stunt, or genuine heroism, which told you everything you needed to know about the outlet's perspective before you read a single word of the article. His assistant, a woman named Paula, who had been managing his communications for 9 years and had the unflappable disposition of someone who had weathered 9 years of exactly this kind of thing, appeared in his office doorway at 4:15 with her tablet in her hand and a look on her face that was professional concern, wearing a very thin mask. "It's everywhere," she said. "I know. I've had 47 calls in the last 2 hours, 3 TV requests, 2 podcast people, a documentary producer, and someone from a morning show who really wants you to come sit on their couch and talk about your feelings." "No. I told them no." She stepped into the office. "But Dominic, the story is out. Whether you engage or not, people are going to be talking. Your legal team is saying," "Paula," she stopped. "Is she safe?" He said it quietly. "Emma, do we know if the family's been approached by press?" Paula looked at him. A small shift happened in her expression, something that was neither professional nor entirely manageable. I can find out." "Find out." He turned back to the window. And if they have been, if anyone has shown up at their building, at the school, anywhere near them, I want it handled quietly. No journalist near that family. Not while the girl's still processing what happened. How do I? You'll figure it out, he said. You always do. She left. Dominic spent the rest of the afternoon ignoring 47 calls and reading the same 6 files over and over, looking for something he might have missed. He found it at 6 p.m. A name buried in one of the forum thread fragments, a username untraceable on the surface but cross-referenced with a detail in the second file. It pointed to an address in the Bronx, a shared email by someone Foltz had communicated with regularly in the months before Emma's abduction. He picked up the phone again. This time he called Carver. I need surveillance on an address, he said, and read it off the screen. Not intervention, just eyes. I want to know who comes and goes, and I want photographs. Carver didn't ask why. On it. That was the thing about Carver Dominic had always thought. The man understood the difference between a question that needed answering and a job that needed doing. In 20 years, he had never confused the two. By 7 p.m., the story had taken on a second layer. One of the news segments, a local evening broadcast, had gotten a statement from Gary Foltz's attorney. Brief, carefully worded, and absolutely enraging. The attorney said his client maintained his innocence and suggested that the intervention by a known organized crime figure had resulted in his client being coerced and threatened before law enforcement arrived. The attorney used the word vigilante 3 times in 45 seconds. He suggested that Emma's identification of his client as her abductor might have been influenced by the highly charged atmosphere of the encounter. Dominic watched this segment on the television in his office and felt something he rarely felt, the specific clarifying fury of watching a man try to weaponize a little girl's courage against her. He picked up the phone, called Jacobs. I saw it, Jacobs said before Dominic could speak. What does he have? Nothing. Foltz has nothing. His attorney is doing what attorneys do, manufacturing smoke. We have Emma's statement. We have corroboration from your men and from the female officer who interviewed Emma independently. We have the physical evidence of Foltz's presence at the playground on 3 separate dates in the last month, recovered from his own phone's location data, and we now have, Jacobs paused and Dominic heard papers moving, one of the 3 names from your files. A woman, 20s now. She was 11 when Foltz targeted her. She called us this afternoon. She wants to talk. Dominic closed his eyes for 1 second. Opened them. Good, he said. There's more, Jacob said. His voice had changed. Dropped. The way a voice drops when what comes next is heavier than what came before. The address in the Bronx. Dominic went very still. You know about it? We've been watching it independently for 6 weeks in connection with a separate investigation. When I got your files this morning and cross-referenced, it connected. A pause. Reyes, Foltz wasn't working alone. The man at that address, we think he was the one who identified Emma, did the initial surveillance. Foltz was the pickup, somebody else was the spotter. The room seemed to contract slightly. A network, Dominic said. It came out flat, statement not question. Possibly we're still building the picture, but yeah, possibly a network. Jacobs exhaled. This is bigger than one man grabbing a kid off a playground. This is organized. And Emma, he stopped. What about Emma? Emma may not have been the first. The silence that followed had weight to it, physical pressing. Wait. Dominic stood at his window and held the phone to his ear and looked at the city below, millions of people going about their evenings, eating dinner, watching television, helping kids with homework, and thought about all the things happening in the spaces between those ordinary moments that most people never knew about and couldn't allow themselves to imagine. How long, he said. We think the network's been active for at least 2 years, maybe longer. Jacobs's voice was tight, controlled. The way a detective's voice gets when the case has become something personal, even though they need it not to be. We have gaps. We have missing pieces. But what we have is enough to move forward, and what you gave me this morning said it filled in 3 of those gaps. I need you to know that. Dominic said nothing. Reyes. Jacobs waited. You did the right thing, last night and this morning. I need you to know I'm aware of that. Find them, Dominic said. All of them. Every single one. He ended the call. He stood at the window for a long time after that. Long enough for the sky to shift from gray to dark, for the city's lights to come fully on. long enough to feel the particular exhausting weight of knowing something that couldn't be unknown, that the danger Emma had been in was broader and deeper and more deliberate than a single predator on a single rainy evening. He thought about the signal, about Emma raising her hand in a crowd and choosing him, and he thought about the children who had been in the same kind of danger and hadn't had a teacher who taught them the signal, or hadn't found anyone in the crowd who looked back, or had found someone who looked back and then looked away again. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then something made him. Yes, a woman's voice, tight with anxiety, but controlled. Is this? I'm sorry, I don't know how you'll receive this call. My name is Claire, Emma's mom. I got your number from Detective Jacobs. He said you'd given permission for me to. She stopped, cleared her throat. I'm sorry, I don't really know how to do this. Dominic moved away from the window, sat down. It's all right, he said. Take your time. Claire took a breath. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you since last night, and nothing seems like enough. Nothing. Her voice broke. Just briefly. One fracture in the composure quickly repaired. She was in her bed last night. She slept. I sat next to her until 3 a.m, and she actually slept, which the crisis counselor said was a good sign. And I sat there and thought, if you had walked past them, if you'd been on the other side of the street or looking at your phone, or if it had just been 30 seconds different in either direction. Don't, Dominic said. Quiet, firm. Don't do that to yourself. I know, I just... She stopped again. When she spoke next, her voice was different, steadier. Emma told me what you said to her when you crouched down. She said you told her she was safe, and she said you said it like you meant it. Not like grown-ups sometimes say things to calm kids down, but like you actually meant it. A pause. She said she believed you. Dominic pressed the heel of his hand against the edge of his desk. Said nothing. I called to say thank you, Claire said. I know that doesn't cover it. I know there's no word for what I'm trying to say. But thank you for seeing her, for not walking past. The silence between them lasted a few seconds, not uncomfortable. The kind that exists when something has been said that doesn't require a response, just space. How is she? Dominic asked. Shaken, but Claire seemed to consider this carefully, proud, I think, which surprised me. She's not describing herself as a victim. She keeps saying she did the signal, like it's something she accomplished. A short, wet sound that might have been a laugh or might have been the edge of a cry. It was hard to tell. Her teacher called this morning, Miss Brennan. She cried on the phone for 10 minutes. The signal saved her life, Dominic said. Emma's right to be proud. She asked about you, Claire said. He hadn't expected that. He said nothing, waiting. She asked if you were a good person. Claire let that sit for a moment. I didn't know what to tell her. I told her you were a person who did a good thing, and that sometimes that's what matters most. Dominic looked at the dark window, at his own faint reflection in the glass. That's the right answer, he said. After he ended the call, he sat without moving for several minutes. The files were still open on his desk. Jacob's words were still in his head. This is organized, this is bigger. Emma may not have been the first. His contacts in the Bronx were watching an address. A woman who had been 11 years old when Foltz found her was sitting somewhere tonight deciding whether to speak. There were pieces in motion now that he had set in motion. Things that would move whether he stayed involved or not. The proper channels would do their work. Jacobs was good at his job. The system, slow and imperfect as it was pointed in the right direction. He could walk away from this now. Close the files. Let the professionals handle it. Go back to the real estate negotiation and the 7 other things that required his attention, and let this be the story it was already becoming in the press, the unlikely one-night intersection of a man like him and a child who needed saving. He pulled the files closer. He wasn't walking away. Not yet. He picked up his phone and called Carver again. The address in the Bronx, he said. Tell me what you have so far. Carver's voice was measured, professional. 2 individuals have entered and exited since we started watching. One we've identified, one we haven't. The identified one, a pause, the sound of paper, has a record. Fraud 2 counts, and 1 charge from 2019 that was dropped for insufficient evidence. Another pause. The drop charge was for the production and distribution of material involving minors. The room went very quiet. The second individual, Dominic said, the unidentified one. Male, 30s or 40s, never looked at the camera, kept his face-down hat on, collar up. Deliberate. Keep watching, Dominic said. He set the phone down. He thought about Emma, about her saying, I looked at your eyes, and you didn't look away. He thought about how many children in how many cities had looked at a crowd and found no one who looked back. He opened a new file on his laptop, started a list, names, addresses, connections, fragments, the kind of list that in his world had a specific purpose and usually ended in a specific way. Then he stopped. He stared at the list for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone and called Jacobs a third time. Jacobs answered immediately. Reyes. The address in the Bronx, Dominic said. I have surveillance on it. I'm going to share everything I get in real time. But Jacobs, he stopped, chose the next words carefully. This goes through you, all of it, every step. I'm not handling this the way I would usually handle something. A beat of silence. Why not? Jacobs asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question. Dominic looked at the window, at the city. Because Emma gave a speech when he said, in her head, in the middle of being terrified, she gave a speech. She remembered what her teacher said. She chose the right person. She did it right. She trusted the system enough to use the signal. He paused. I'm not going to be the reason the system lets her down after that. Jacobs was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. Send me everything. In the morning, Dominic said. Get some sleep. Jacobs, you sound like you need it. You're one to talk. He almost smiled. He closed the laptop, left the files on the desk, walked to the window one more time, and looked out at the city that never went completely dark, not at any hour, and thought about a woman named Claire sitting on the edge of a bed watching her daughter breathe. About a little girl in a yellow dress who had trusted the world to see her. About a retired school counselor named Mrs. Alvarez, who had taught a bunch of kids in a Brooklyn building a signal they would hopefully never need, and had been right and had been wrong all at once. He stood there for a long time. The city moved below him, relentless and indifferent and alive. And Dominic Reyes, for the first time and longer than he could remember, felt the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being changed by something he hadn't chosen. The woman's name was Sandra Cho, and she was 26 years old, and she had not said the name Gary Foltz out loud in 15 years. She said it on a Wednesday morning in a small conference room at the 34th Precinct, with Detective Jacobs sitting across from her, and a female victim's advocate named Rosa beside her, and a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched, going cold in front of her. She said it in a voice that didn't shake, which Jacobs told Dominic later was one of the bravest things he'd witnessed in 30 years on the force, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was, and she said it anyway. Dominic wasn't in the room. He hadn't asked to be. This wasn't his moment to occupy. He knew that much. What he knew, because Jacobs called him at noon, was that Sandra had given a full statement. 11 years old when Foltz had targeted her at a community center in the Bronx. The grooming had lasted 3 months. Her parents hadn't known until it was nearly too late, and when they'd gone to the police, the detective who took the report had done the minimum and moved on, and the prosecutor who reviewed the file had decided the case wasn't strong enough, and Gary Foltz had walked out of the process essentially untouched. Sandra had spent 15 years carrying that. Not just the original thing. The thing itself, which was bad enough, but the specific secondary wound of having told the truth to the people whose job it was to act on it and watching them choose not to. She came back anyway, Jacob said on the phone. His voice was tight. After everything that happened to her the first time, the way the system handled it, she came back anyway because she heard about Emma and decided she wasn't going to let it happen again to someone else. Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is her statement usable?" More than usable. It's the kind of testimony that changes how a jury looks at a defendant. It establishes pattern. It establishes that this wasn't an isolated decision or a moment of weakness. This is who Foltz is, has been, for at least 15 years. A pause. Combined with the location data from his phone, the testimony from your men, Emma's statement, and Jacob stopped. And the information your surveillance team pulled from the Bronx address last night. Jacobs exhaled. Your guy came through Reyes, the second individual, the unidentified one. We ran the image against our database and got a match. His name is Peter Wall. He's 44. He runs a legitimate-looking courier business out of New Jersey as a front, and he has a federal flag on his file from an investigation that was closed in 2021 because the lead investigator retired and nobody picked it back up. Dominic stood up from his desk without thinking about it. A federal flag. This goes up the chain, Jacob said. Higher than me. I've already made 2 calls this morning that I probably can't talk about, and by this afternoon, there's going to be a task force involved, which means Reyes, he paused carefully, it means this becomes something bigger than what either of us can manage directly. Once the federal people step in, I lose some control over the direction. But Foltz still gets prosecuted. Foltz absolutely still gets prosecuted. He's the lowest hanging fruit in a very ugly tree. He's already charged. The DIA isn't going to drop that regardless of what the federal case looks like. Jacob's voice steadied. Emma's case is solid. She's protected. Dominic sat back down. The tightness in his chest eased a fraction. Good. I need to ask you something, Jacob said. Ask. The information from the Bronx, the surveillance. I need to be able to account for it officially. Not how you got it, I don't want that answer, but I need a plausible chain that a federal attorney won't immediately throw out of court. A beat. I'm asking you to be creative. I'll have something to you by end of day, Dominic said. He spent the next 2 hours on the phone with his attorney, a sharp and permanently exhausted man named Gerald, who had been keeping Dominic's affairs structurally sound for 12 years and had long since stopped being surprised by the nature of the calls. By 3 o'clock, there was a framework, a private security consultation retroactively documented that would explain the surveillance without implicating anyone who couldn't afford to be implicated. It wasn't elegant, but it was solid. He sent it to Jacobs at 3:47 p.m. Jacobs responded with a single text. Good enough. Thank you. That evening, Paula came into his office and stood in the doorway with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she expected him to push back on. The press has found Claire, she said. Dominic looked up. 2 journalists showed up outside their building this afternoon. Emma's school called Claire to warn her that there was a camera crew on the sidewalk across from the front entrance. Paula held his gaze. The family hasn't made any statements. Claire told Emma it was just people doing their jobs and tried to keep her calm. But Emma, she stopped. What? Emma apparently told her mother and I, quote, they should be filming Gary Foltz, not us. We didn't do anything wrong. Paula said it quietly. The school counselor called Claire afterward. Said Emma had a meltdown in the bathroom during lunch. Wouldn't come out for 20 minutes, but she walked back into class on her own. Told her teacher she was fine. Dominic absorbed that in silence. She's 8 years old, he said. I know. He stood up. I want the press off that building. Off the school block. Not confrontationally, I don't want a scene that puts her name back in the news, but off. How do you want me to? There's a property management company that handles the building's exterior maintenance, Dominic said. He had pulled the address from the files 2 days ago and had found this information at the bottom of one page without quite knowing why he'd noted it. They have a contract dispute pending with the city over a permit. I know someone in the permits office. The dispute gets resolved faster than expected. The company is grateful, and grateful companies sometimes offer their services. He paused. It's not coercion, it's proximity. The crew sets up outside and finds their angle suddenly occupied by scaffolding. They'll move on in a day. Paula looked at him for a long moment. What? He said. Nothing, she said. But something in her face had shifted slightly, the way a person's face shifts when they're updating a long-held assumption. I'll make the calls. After she left, Dominic sat with the quiet for a few minutes. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out the envelope he'd put there 2 days ago and hadn't moved since. Inside, it was a single piece of paper with 2 figures written on it. One for 6 months of private therapy for Emma with a child trauma specialist his attorney's wife had recommended as the best in the city. One for 3 months of building security upgrades for Claire's apartment. Both figures were significant. Both had been routed through a foundation his attorney had set up years ago for exactly this kind of purpose, charitable disbursement that could not be traced to Dominic directly. He had been looking at the envelope every day and not sending it. The reason he hadn't sent it was something he was honest enough with himself to identify. He didn't know if it was for Emma or for himself. Whether it was genuine care or the need to feel that he had done enough, that the discomfort he was carrying could be resolved by a financial transaction and go away. He sat with that question for another few minutes. Then he thought about Sandra Cho walking into the 34th precinct and saying the name Gary Foltz out loud for the first time in 15 years because a little girl in a yellow dress had done the right thing and Sandra had decided she wasn't going to be the person who didn't show up for her. He sealed the envelope and called Paula back. "I need this hand-delivered," he said, "not mailed, delivered directly to the foundation coordinator. Today." "I'll go myself," she said. She took the envelope without looking at the figures inside, which was another thing he had always respected about her. The call he didn't expect came at 8:15 that evening. His phone showed the 34th precinct's direct line. He answered immediately. It wasn't Jacobs. It was a man who introduced himself as Special Agent David Merritt, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Crimes Against Children Unit. His voice was careful and professional and carried the particular texture of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had learned to keep the difficulty behind the professional. "Mr. Reyes," Merritt said, "I'll be direct with you because I think that's what the situation calls for." "Please," Dominic said. "We've been building a case on Peter Wall for 14 months. Not the 2021 case, a new one. The 2021 case fell apart for administrative reasons that I won't get into, but we restarted. 14 months of work, 2 undercover operations, 17 individuals under surveillance." A pause. The arrest of Gary Foltz 5 days ago and the subsequent identification of Wall through surveillance footage has created a situation. A positive situation, don't misunderstand me. It's accelerated our timeline, but it's also created a risk. Dominic was very still. "What kind of risk?" "Wall knows Foltz was arrested. He doesn't know yet how Foltz was identified or how quickly law enforcement connected them. But he's careful, Mr. Reyes. He's been careful for 14 months of us watching him, and he's never given us enough. If he figures out the connection is closer than he thinks, if he runs..." Merritt stopped. 14 months of work disappears," Dominic said. "Worse than that, 14 months of work disappears and he surfaces somewhere else in 6 months under a different name, and we start again, and the people he has access to during those 6 months..." Merritt didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Dominic closed his eyes. "What do you need from me?" "I need to know if your surveillance of the Bronx address is ongoing." "It is." "I need it to stop." The agent's voice was firm but not harsh. "Every additional person in proximity to that address increases the chance that Wall notices something unusual. My team is already there. Adding another layer, even a discrete one, introduces variables we can't control." It was a reasonable ask. Dominic knew it was a reasonable ask. It was also in a specific way that he had to work to examine honestly a deflation, the realization that the thing he was doing, the surveillance, the files, the late nights, was now something that was potentially getting in the way of people who were better positioned to finish the job. "Done," he said. "I'll pull the team tonight." "Thank you." Merritt paused. "I want to say something else, and I want to say it without it being interpreted as flattery because it isn't." "Go ahead." "What you did 5 nights ago, the rescue and the information you provided to Detective Jacobs afterward, it handed us something we've been trying to build for over a year. The connection between Foltz and Wall was a gap we knew existed but couldn't close. You closed it in 48 hours. A pause. "I don't know how, and I'm not asking, but I want you to know that what you started, we are going to finish." Dominic sat in the silence of his office for a harsh moment after the call ended. He called Carver. "Pull the team from the Bronx address. Tonight. Clean exit, nothing left behind." Carver didn't ask a single question. "Done within the hour." Dominic set the phone down. He felt something strange, not relief, not exactly. Something less comfortable than relief. The sensation of having handed something over. Of being for the first time in as long as he could remember in a situation where the next moves were not his to make. He wasn't sure he liked it, but he understood it, and understanding it was something. The next morning he did something he had not done in 11 years. He drove himself. No Carver, no escort, no Escalade. He took his personal car, a gray sedan that drew no attention, and drove to a neighborhood in the Bronx he hadn't visited since childhood. He parked on a street he recognized from memory, rather than from the address, walked half a block and stopped in front of a building with a green awning that still said Community Learning Center. In white letters, the same letters it had said when he was 9 years old, and his mother had brought him here on Saturdays for reading programs. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the door for a moment. Then he went inside. The director was a heavy-set woman in her 60s named Margaret Okafor, who had been running the center for 22 years and had the composed, seen-it-all energy of someone who had dealt with every variety of difficult situation and come out the other side with her principles intact. She looked at Dominic across her desk and, to her credit, showed no visible reaction to who he was or what she might have read about him. "I want to make a donation," Dominic said, "specifically for your after-school safety curriculum. I've been looking at what you offer, and there are programs in other cities that have incorporated personal safety education for children, things like distress signals, how to identify unsafe situations, how to get help when speaking isn't an option." He paused. "I'd like to fund an expansion of that program here, and in 3 other centers I've identified in Brooklyn and Manhattan." Margaret looked at him steadily. "May I ask why?" It was a fair question, and she deserved a real answer. "Because a little girl learned a signal from her teacher," he said, "and it saved her life. And there are children in this city who don't have a teacher who knows to teach it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We've been trying to get funding for a safety curriculum expansion for 2 years. The grant applications take 6 months and usually come back with 80% of what we asked for." "Tell me the number," Dominic said. "The real number. What full implementation looks like." She told him. He didn't blink. "You'll have it by end of next week. Through a foundation, the documentation will be clean, no conditions attached, no naming rights, no press." He stood. "The program should be named after whoever designed it, not after a donor." Margaret stood too. She extended her hand across the desk. He shook it. Walking back to his car, Dominic passed a playground 2 buildings down from the community center. A dozen children were on the equipment, their voices carrying in the cold air. He stopped for a moment without quite meaning to. A little girl near the far end caught his eye. Not Emma, a different child, maybe 6 years old, with braids and a red coat, currently in a heated negotiation with another child over a piece of playground equipment, gesturing with enormous conviction. She was absolutely fine. She was in the middle of the smallest possible conflict and treating it with complete seriousness, the way children do. He stood there for probably 30 seconds longer than made sense. Then his phone rang. He pulled it out expecting Carver or Gerald or Paula. The screen said Jacobs. He answered. "What happened?" "Wall moved." Jacobs' voice was sharp and fast. "Last night after you pulled your team, within 3 hours, he left the Bronx front address. Merritt's people followed him. He drove to a storage unit in New Jersey that Merritt's team didn't have under surveillance." A pause. "He went in. He was inside for 22 minutes. When he came out..." Jacobs stopped. "Jacobs. He came out with 2 other people. An adult male we haven't identified yet, and another stop, shorter this time, like something was stuck." "Tell me," Dominic said. "A girl, approximately 9 or 10 years old. She wasn't his daughter. Merritt's team confirmed that within 5 minutes of the visual. Jacobs cleared his throat. "She's in federal custody now. She's safe. Merritt's team moved the moment they saw her. Wall and the male are in custody. The girl has been transported to a hospital. She's physically unharmed." Dominic stood on the sidewalk outside the playground and put one hand flat against the wall of the building beside him. He breathed. "She's safe," Jacobs repeated. It sounded like the detective was saying it as much for himself as for Dominic. "She's safe." "Who is she?" His voice came out steady. He was grateful for that. "We don't have an ID yet. No missing persons match in the immediate system. Merritt thinks she may be from out of state. They're running it now." Jacobs paused. "What you did, Reyes, pulling your team when Merritt asked. If your people had still been in position when Wall moved, he might have spotted them. If he spotted them, he runs without the girl. Or worse." The detective let that land. "You made the right call." Dominic didn't respond to that. "There's going to be a press conference this afternoon," Jacobs said. "Federal case. Merritt's handling the statement. Your name won't come up. We've kept you out of the federal picture entirely. As far as the public record is concerned, the surveillance that identified Wall came through routine interagency information sharing. Good. But Reyes, Jacob's voice shifted, something human beneath a professional surface. Unofficially, between you and me standing here in my office where nobody's recording anything. He paused. You started this 5 nights ago on a rainy sidewalk when you didn't walk past a little girl. Everything that followed Sandra coming forward, Wall being identified, that child in New Jersey being found tonight, instead of never, it has a single point of origin. A long pause. I've been doing this job for 30 years. I know what it looks like when one decision changes the whole shape of a case. This was that decision, and I'm not going to forget it. Dominic looked at the playground. The little girl in the red coat had apparently won her negotiation and was now at the top of the slide triumphant. Find out who she is, Dominic said. The girl from New Jersey. Find out who she belongs to and get her home. We will, Jacob said. The call ended. Dominic stood on that sidewalk for another minute, maybe 2. A city moving around him, indifferent and constant. The children on the playground behind him, loud and present and safe. He thought about Emma's signal. That small fist raised for 2 seconds in a crowd. He thought about how signals worked, how one scent correctly seen by the right person at the right moment could travel outward in ways the sender could never predict. Sandra coming forward. A federal case accelerating. A child in New Jersey found in a storage unit in New Jersey on a cold morning because 14 months of careful work finally had the last piece it needed. All of it branching out from a single moment on a rainy Manhattan sidewalk. He walked back to his car. He drove to his office, went upstairs, sat at his desk, opened the file he'd been building, not the intelligence file, but a different one. Names of the 4 community centers, curriculum documents, the contact information for the child safety educator whose program he'd read about the night before, who worked out of Chicago and had spent 12 years developing exactly the kind of curriculum he'd described to Margaret Okafor. He drafted an email and then stopped and called instead because some conversations needed to be spoken. The educator's name was Dr. Patricia Ewan. She answered her own phone, which he hadn't expected. He explained what he wanted, simply and without decoration. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, I've been trying to get someone to fund this expansion for 4 years. Do you know how many grant committees I've sat in front of? How many PowerPoint presentations I've given to rooms full of people who said they cared and then approved 12% of the ask? I'm not a grant committee, Dominic said. No, she said, you're not. Another pause. You're Dominic Reyes. I am. She considered this. He let her. Whatever conclusion she arrived at, he wanted her to arrive at it on her own. The program works, she said finally. I have 8 years of data. Children who complete it are statistically more likely to recognize unsafe situations and take appropriate action. The signal component alone, she stopped. Then quietly, the signal component. That's why you're calling. Yes. I heard about the girl in New York. Yes. Patricia Ewan was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Tell me what you need. He told her. By the time he hung up, it was past 6 in the evening. Paula had left 2 hours ago. The office was empty and quiet. He sat in the quiet and thought about 4 community centers and a curriculum and dozens of children who would learn something that just might be the thing that saved them on some future rainy evening when the world had narrowed to a crowd of strangers and one raised hand was all they had. He thought about a 9-year-old girl in a New Jersey hospital physically unharmed who would tonight or tomorrow or sometime in the next 72 hours be identified and returned to someone who loved her. He thought about Emma, about what she was doing right now, homework maybe, dinner, the ordinary machinery of a child's evening grinding forward, the signal her teacher had taught her which she had used correctly and which had started something she would never fully know the shape of. He pulled out his phone and typed a text to Jacobs. Let me know when the girl from New Jersey has a name. Jacobs replied 4 minutes later. You'll be the first call. He set the phone face up on his desk and looked at it and thought about how the smallest things moved the largest things if they landed in the right place at the right time, seen by the right eyes. He thought about a rainy evening and a yellow dress and a small fist raised for 2 seconds. He thought once was enough. And for the first time in 5 days, the thing in his chest that had been coiled and taut since that sidewalk began very slowly to ease. The girl from New Jersey had a name by Thursday morning. Jacobs called at 7:03 a.m. earlier than he'd promised, which told Dominic everything he needed to know about the weight of what he was about to say before a single word of it was spoken. Her name is Maya Ruiz, Jacobs said. She's 9 years old. She's from Trenton. She disappeared 8 days ago from outside her apartment building while waiting for the school bus. A pause that had something heavy in it. Her mother filed a missing persons report the same morning. It went into the system. Nobody connected it to the Wall investigation because nobody knew to connect it. 8 days. Dominic sat with that number for a moment. 8 days this child had been gone, and her mother had been living inside the specific airless terror of not knowing. She's been identified and reunited, he asked. Last night at 11 p.m. Jacob's voice had something in it that wasn't quite professional detachment and wasn't quite not. Her mother drove from Trenton to the hospital in 40 minutes, which, if you know the traffic between Trenton and the hospital, is not a thing that should be physically possible. He stopped. The nurses said they could hear the mother crying from 2 floors away, the good kind. Dominic sat in his chair and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Okay, he said. It wasn't a sufficient word, he knew that. He said it anyway because sometimes the insufficient word was the only honest one. There's more, Jacob said. There was always more. Dominic had been in enough unfolding situations to know that the word more from Jacobs meant something he wasn't going to be comfortable hearing. The federal task force executed search warrants on the storage unit and on 4 additional addresses connected to Wall's network last night, Jacobs said. Between 12 and 4 a.m., 8 p.m., 7 arrests total, including Wall and the unidentified male from the storage unit, whose name is Thomas Greer, 41 New Jersey prior charges for fraud, and 1 prior charge involving a minor that was never prosecuted. He paused. They also recovered evidence connecting the network to activity going back 4 years, not just surveillance and targeting documentation. Records. Dominic understood what that meant without Jacobs spelling it out. He didn't ask Jacobs to spell it out. How many children? He said. Jacobs was quiet for 3 seconds. They're still building the picture, he said carefully. Merritt is not releasing numbers until they're certain, but what I can tell you is that the evidence recovered last night is significant, and that the network was larger than anyone had estimated even 48 hours ago. The silence that followed was the kind where both people on the line knew something terrible and were deciding separately and together how to hold it without collapsing under it. Gary Foltz, Dominic said. Where does he sit in all of this? Foltz is cooperating. Jacob said it flat and clean, the way you'd say something you weren't sure whether to be relieved or disgusted about. His attorney made the call yesterday afternoon. Foltz is trading everything he knows about the network for a sentencing recommendation. Merritt accepted because Foltz knows things that accelerate the timeline significantly. Another pause. He's going to prison Reyes. The cooperation deal reduces his sentence but doesn't eliminate it. He's going to prison for a long time. Emma will not have to testify against him. His guilty plea is part of the deal. Dominic heard the last part clearly. Emma would not have to stand up in a courtroom and relive it. He hadn't realized he'd been quietly carrying that particular anxiety until he felt it leave. And Sandra Cho, he said, Sandra's statement stands as part of the record regardless of the plea deal. It will matter in the sentencing. The judge will hear it. Jacobs's voice softened slightly. She knows. I called her first. She said, and I'm going to try to quote this accurately because it deserves to be said right. She said, good. Then it meant something. All of it meant something. Dominic closed his eyes. It meant something, he agreed. He spent the morning at his desk doing the work he was supposed to be doing. The real estate negotiation had been rescheduled and finally happened at 9 a.m. over a conference call, and 3 other things that required his attention moved through the morning in their orderly, businesslike way. He handled all of it with the usual precision. The numbers were what they were. The decisions were what they were by now. But between calls and the small gaps, his mind kept returning to a single question he couldn't fully answer. What happened now? Not to Foltz, not to Wall, not to the federal case. Those things were in motion and would resolve themselves through systems he had set in motion but no longer had a hand in. What happened to him? What Dominic Reyes did with the particular shift that had occurred in the architecture of himself on him over the last 6 days. Because something had shifted. He was honest enough to feel it, even if he wasn't fully ready to name it. Paula appeared in his doorway at noon with lunch he hadn't asked for and the face she made when she had something to say that wasn't on the agenda. "Ms. Brennan called," she said. He looked up. Who is Emma's teacher? The one who taught her the signal. Paula set the lunch on the corner of his desk. "She got my number from the community center director, Margaret Okafor. She called to thank you for the curriculum donation." She paused. "She also said..." Paula stopped, looked at the desk, looked back up. "She said she's been teaching that signal for 6 years, to every class she's had. She said she never knew if any of them would ever need it. She said she used to wonder sometimes if it was pointless, if she was teaching children to prepare for something that statistically might never happen." Another pause. "She said she doesn't wonder that anymore." Dominic looked at his lunch and didn't touch it. "Tell her," he started, stopped. "What do you say to that?" Paula was quiet for a moment. "I think you say keep teaching it." He nodded. "Tell her that." She left. He sat with the quiet for a minute. Then his phone rang and everything changed. Not Jacobs, not Carver, not Gerald or Paula or anyone in the organized perimeter of his professional life. The number on the screen was one he recognized from the single call 3 days ago, Claire's number. He answered it. "I'm sorry to call again." Her voice was different today. Not the careful, controlled gratitude of the first call. Something more frayed at the edges. Tighter. "I need to tell you something, and I didn't know who else to tell." He sat forward. "What happened?" "Emma's school. Today." Claire's breath was audible. She was working to keep her voice level and mostly succeeding. "One of the parents we think brought a news article to the school this morning. A printed copy. About you. About who you are. What your business is. What the papers say about you." She stopped. "Someone gave it to a child in Emma's class, and that child showed it to Emma during lunch." The room was very quiet. "What did Emma do?" he asked. His voice was steady. He made it steady. "She read it," Claire said. "She read the whole thing. The other kids were watching her, apparently waiting to see. I don't know what they were waiting for her to cry maybe, or say something." Claire's voice broke slightly at the edge. "She read the whole article, and then she folded it in half, and she handed it back, and she said the lunch monitor told me this because she was standing right there. Emma said, 'I know who he is. He looked at me when nobody else did. That's all I need to know.'" Dominic put his hand flat on the desk. "She said it in front of the whole table," Claire continued. 8-year-olds. And then she picked up her fork and kept eating. A sound that was half laugh and half something that had no name. "She's 8 years old, and she's got more clear-eyed confidence than..." Claire stopped. "I'm sorry, I'm calling because I needed you to know that. I don't know why exactly, I just needed you to know." "I know why you called," Dominic said. And he did, because some things needed a witness, because the courage of a small person mattered more if it was known by someone who understood the full weight of what it had cost. "She's doing really well," Claire said. It sounded like she still partly couldn't believe it. "The therapist says she's processing it in a remarkably healthy way. She's not minimizing it, she knows it was serious, and she talks about it, but she's not letting it be the center of everything either." She said, Claire paused. Emma said she doesn't want to be known as the girl something bad almost happened to. She wants to be known as the girl who used the signal. Something moved in Dominic's chest, not the coiled, taut feeling of the last 6 days. Something different, warmer, harder to look at directly. "That's exactly right," he said. He got off the call 20 minutes later, having spent most of it listening rather than speaking, which was the appropriate ratio. When he set the phone down, he sat for a moment doing nothing, which was unusual for him, and then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He called his mother. She answered on the 3rd ring and said his name the way she always said it, not his professional name, not Reyes, but the name she'd given him before the world had renamed him, and he sat in his office surrounded by the apparatus of his power and his choices and his history, and talked to her for 45 minutes about nothing in particular. The weather, her neighbor's new dome, a recipe she'd been meaning to try. The conversation his mother had apparently had with Mrs. Alvarez, still alive at 81, still sharp about an article she'd seen in the news. Rosa Alvarez told me she saw it, his mother said carefully near the end of the call. Rosa Alvarez, Mrs. Alvarez, the woman who had taught the whole building those signals all those years ago. She said she recognized what the girl did. The signal. A pause. She said she taught you that, mijo, when you were small. She did, Dominic said. His mother was quiet for a moment. She cried, she said. Rosa Alvarez, who I have never seen cry in 40 years, cried. She said she had taught that signal to 100 children and prayed to God none of them would ever need it. And then she said, Barjin, his mother's voice went soft. She said, God is clever, because the child who needed it found the one person in the crowd who knew to look for it. Dominic said nothing. Are you okay? His mother asked. Simply, the way only a mother can ask a question that lands exactly at the center of the thing. I think so, he said. I think I'm working on it. She accepted that without pushing on it. Another thing only a mother knows to do. He was on his way out of the office at 4 p.m. earlier than usual, which caused Paula to look up from her desk with an expression of mild surprise when Carver appeared at his shoulder with the expression he wore when information had arrived that required immediate processing. What? Dominic said. Wall's attorney made a statement 20 minutes ago. Carver kept his voice low and even. He's contesting the chain of evidence. He's claiming the surveillance used to identify Wall was obtained improperly, that it came from a source with criminal ties and therefore the evidence should be inadmissible. A pause. He specifically mentioned that law enforcement's initial connection to the Wall address, it came through materials provided by another pause, an unnamed organized crime figure. Dominic stopped walking. He's naming me, Dominic said, not a question. Not by name, not yet. But the implication is clear enough that 3 news outlets have already started making calls. Carver held his gaze steadily. Gerald is already on it. He says the documentation you created, the private security consultation framework, is solid enough to hold up to scrutiny. But it's going to get looked at very carefully. Dominic thought about this. 14 months of federal work. 7 arrests, Maya Ruiz home with her mother, Sandra Cho's statement in the official record, a network dismantled, and now Wall's attorney was looking for a thread to pull that might unravel it. Call Gerald, Dominic said. Tell him I want a meeting tonight. And call Jacobs, he needs to know before he hears it from a reporter. Carver was already on the phone before Dominic reached the elevator. The meeting with Gerald happened at 6:30 in Gerald's office neutral ground, which Gerald always preferred for conversations that might eventually become part of a legal record. Gerald was 62 years old, perpetually tired, and had the unsettling quality of seeming most calm exactly when the situation was most serious. He spread 3 documents on the desk between them and talked for 20 minutes. The framework was solid, he confirmed. The private security consultation was documented, backdated properly within legal bounds, and corroborated by 2 independent parties whose names Dominic didn't ask about. Wall's attorney could contest the chain of evidence, but contesting it required proving that the framework was fabricated, which required evidence that didn't exist. However, Gerald said, and he said it in the specific way that meant what followed was the thing Dominic needed to sit with carefully. However, Dominic repeated, the federal case does not rest on your surveillance alone. Merritt's team had 14 months of independent work before your materials entered the picture. Your contribution closed gaps. It didn't create the foundation. A competent federal prosecutor, which Merritt has access to, will be able to demonstrate that the case stands independently of the disputed materials. Gerald looked at him over the top of his reading glasses. What Wall's attorney is doing is noise. It's designed to create headlines and make the prosecution's life difficult during discovery. It's not likely to succeed, but it will create a period of, he chose the word carefully, visibility, for you, for your involvement. How long a period? 2 to 4 weeks of news cycle activity, then it fades unless something unexpected happens. Gerald removed his reading glasses and set them on the documents. The question is whether you want to be proactive or quiet during that period. Dominic looked at the documents. Quiet, he said. I don't have a public position in this. I'm a private citizen who observed a crime and reported it. That's the statement. Gerald nodded. That's exactly right. And it's defensible because it's true. He paused. Dominic, I want to say something that's outside the legal advice. Dominic looked at him. I've been your attorney for 12 years, Gerald said. I've seen you make a lot of decisions in that time. Good ones and bad ones and ones that were neither and both simultaneously. He folded his hands on the desk. This one, he stopped. Started again. What you've done over the last week, the way you've done it, I want you to know that I'm aware of it, all of it, and I think you should be too. Dominic said nothing. You could have walked past her, Gerald said, and everything that followed Sandra's statement, Maya Ruiz being found, the 7 arrests, whatever comes next, in that federal case, none of it happens. You were the variable Dominic, the one nobody could have predicted. He paused. That's not nothing. Whatever else is true about you, that is not nothing. The room was quiet for a moment. Are you going to bill me for this part of the conversation? Dominic asked. Gerald almost smiled. Absolutely, humbling. The news cycle did exactly what Gerald predicted. For 11 days, Wall's attorney's statements circulated. Headlines used the phrase organized crime figure, the way people use a crowbar applied with maximum leverage at the most sensitive points. 3 opinion pieces were written, 2 condemning Dominic's involvement, 1 defending it in a way that managed to be simultaneously complimentary and condescending. Dominic read none of them. What he did during those 11 days was work. The curriculum installation at the 4 community centers, coordinated with Dr. Patricia Ewan, who turned out to be one of the most efficient and no-nonsense people he had encountered in recent memory. She arrived in New York on day 4 with 2 colleagues, a comprehensive implementation plan, and the specific energy of someone who had been waiting for resources to catch up to her ambitions for a very long time. They met once briefly in Margaret Okafor's community center, the 3 of them standing around a folding table with coffee cups and printouts. Dr. Ewan went through the curriculum in details, not a summary, the actual thing, module by module, and Dominic asked questions and she answered them. And Margaret Okafor watched both of them with the quiet satisfaction of a woman seeing 2 very different people agree on what mattered. At one point, Dr. Ewan looked at him directly and said, "Why does a man in your position care this much about a children's safety curriculum?" He met her eyes. Because a little girl raised her hand in a crowd and I happened to be the person who knew what it meant. And there are children in this city and every city who will raise their hands someday and find nobody in the crowd who knows. He paused. I'd like to change the odds. Dr. Ewan held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the printouts. Then let's make sure the curriculum is right, she said. On day 9 of the news cycle, the federal prosecutor released a formal statement confirming that the case against Peter Wall and his co-defendants rested on 14 months of independent FBI investigative work and that no evidence obtained through any external source formed the foundation of the prosecution. Wall's attorney's challenge was characterized in precise prosecutorial language as without legal merit. The headlines shifted. On day 11, they'd moved to something else entirely. That was how news cycles worked. The story wasn't over. It would continue through trials, through sentencing, through whatever came next in the long, slow machinery of the justice system. But the period of visibility Gerald had predicted ended on schedule. And Dominic's name receded from the daily churn. He didn't feel relief. He felt something more complicated, a kind of quiet that had weight to it. The weight of knowing that what had started 6 days ago on a rainy sidewalk was now something that would continue to move through the world in ways he couldn't fully track and hadn't fully chosen. It was 2 weeks after the night on the sidewalk when Jacobs called with the last piece of news Dominic had been waiting for, though he hadn't known he'd been waiting for it until it arrived. Foltz was officially sentenced this morning, Jacobs said. The cooperation deal was honored. He got 14 years, with the federal charges from the network investigation added on top, and the prosecutor pushed hard for those to run consecutively. Not concurrently, he won't be out before his mid-50s. A pause. The judge read Sandra Cho's statement aloud in court. The full statement. Foltz sat there and listened to every word. Jacob stopped. Sandra was in the courtroom, in the gallery. She watched. Dominic thought about that. A 26-year-old woman sitting in a courtroom, watching the man who had targeted her at 11 years old listen to her own words read back to him by a federal judge. The specific, quiet power of that. How did she look? He asked. Steady, Jacob said. She looked absolutely steady. Dominic sat with that for a long moment. There's one more thing, Jacob said. His voice changed. A different register lighter, but carefully, so as if he was carrying something fragile and didn't want to drop it by handling it carelessly. Emma's school is putting on a presentation next week, a safety assembly. They're having Dr. Ewan's team come in and do the first official presentation of the new curriculum. A pause. Emma's teacher, Ms. Brennan, asked if you'd like to attend, not as a speaker, not for any public reason, just to, he stopped. She said, and I'm quoting, he should get to see that it works. The room was very quiet. Dominic looked at the window. What day, he asked. Thursday, Jacob said, 2 o'clock. He wrote it in his calendar, not in Paula's system, in his own, by hand, the way his mother had taught him to write down things that mattered, because if you trusted the important things only to machines, you were one power outage away from forgetting them. Thursday, 2 p.m., Emma's school. He looked at it for a moment after he'd written it. Then he put the pen down and went back to work and carried the Thursday appointment with him through the rest of the day like something he was protecting. Careful with it, aware of it, unwilling to let the ordinary noise of his ordinary life press against it too hard. Thursday was coming, and for reasons he was only beginning to understand, he needed to be there when it did. Thursday arrived the way important days sometimes do, quietly, without announcing itself, slipping in behind the ordinary machinery of a regular morning, as if it hadn't been written in a calendar by hand 2 weeks ago and carried carefully ever since. Dominic was up at 5:30. He didn't know why. He wasn't nervous. He didn't get nervous, hadn't in years had trained that particular response out of himself so thoroughly that it rarely surfaced, even in situations that objectively warranted it. But there was something in him that morning that wasn't quite stillness. A low-frequency alertness he couldn't fully account for. He dressed without thinking about it too hard. No suit, no tie. The kind of clothes a person wore when they were trying not to look like anything in particular. Dark slacks, a simple gray shirt, a coat that was warm but not expensive looking. He stood in front of the mirror for a moment and looked at himself the way he rarely did, which was directly and without agenda, and thought, this is a man going to a school assembly. That's all this is. He believed approximately half of that. He told Carver to stay at the office. Carver looked at him the way Carver sometimes looked at him when an instruction didn't fully compute. You want to go alone? I want to go alone, Dominic confirmed. To a school. To a school. A pause. I'll have my phone, Dominic said. If something comes up. Carver accepted this with the particular dignity of a man who knew when the argument wasn't his to have. I'll be at the office. Dominic drove himself, the same gray sedan, the same anonymity. He found parking 2 blocks from the school and walked, and nobody looked at him twice, which was the point. He arrived at Emma's school at 1:45 p.m. The front office knew he was coming. Ms. Brennan had arranged it, and a young administrative assistant led him to the gymnasium without making a production of it, which he appreciated. He was shown to a seat at the back of the room along the wall away from the main parent section that was filling in toward the front. Just a man in a gray coat sitting quietly in the last row. The gymnasium filled up in the way the school gymnasiums always fill, with a particular organized chaos of several hundred children trying to find their assigned spots, while teachers herded and redirected with the patience of people who had chosen this work and were occasionally reconsidering that choice. He watched it happen with something close to wonder. Not at the chaos, at the energy, the sheer uncontainable aliveness of a room full of children. He found Emma before she found him. She was near the front with her class sitting cross-legged on the floor in the 3rd row from the stage. She was wearing a blue sweater and her hair was in 2 braids, and she was talking to the girl beside her about something that seemed from the hand gestures to be extremely important. She looked like any 8-year-old at a school assembly. She looked completely ordinarily fine. Something in his chest nodded that he hadn't known was knotted. Dr. Patricia Ewan took the stage at 2 o'clock exactly. She was a small woman with a clear, caring voice and the specific gift of being able to speak to a room full of children without either condescending to them or losing them. She introduced the program, simply no long preamble, no bureaucratic framing. She just said, I want to teach you something today that might be the most important thing you learn this year. And the room remarkably went quiet. She taught the signal. She explained it the way Ms. Brennan had presumably explained it, what it meant, when to use it, how to make sure someone saw it. She had children practice it. Hundreds of small hands folded thumbs into palms and held their fists up, and the gymnasium was briefly full of this silent, serious gesture, and Dominic looked at it from the back of the room and felt something so large and complicated move through him that he had to look at the floor for a moment to process it. Then Dr. Ewan said, "I want to tell you about a girl who used this signal." The room went very still. "She was 8 years old," Dr. Ewan said, "and she was in a scary situation. She couldn't scream, she couldn't run, she couldn't say the words, but she remembered what her teacher taught her, and she raised her hand, and someone saw her." Dominic looked up. In the third row, Emma had gone very still. The girl beside her had stopped talking. Emma's hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the stage with an expression Dominic could see even from the back of the room. Not embarrassment, not self-consciousness. Something cleaner and quieter than that. Recognition. "That girl," Dr. Ewan said, "is here in this room today." The gymnasium erupted, not in the chaotic way, in the sudden, collective, held breath way of a room that understood something had just been made real. Children looked around. Teachers looked at each other. A murmur moved through the space like a current. Emma didn't turn around, didn't wave or stand or perform anything. She sat with her hands in her lap and her chin slightly lifted and let the moment be what it was. Her teacher, Mel Brennan, a woman in her early 40s with red hair and the kind of face that had spent years practicing being steady for the sake of other people, crouched down beside Emma and said something quiet. Emma nodded once. Ms. Brennan squeezed her shoulder and stood back up. Dr. Ewan let the murmur settle. Then she said, "She doesn't need applause. She already did the hard part. What she needs, what all of us need, is for every person in this room to remember what she taught us. Because the signal only works if someone knows to look for it." The room was completely quiet now. The particular quiet of children who were actually listening, which was different from the quiet of children being managed into silence. This was chosen quiet. Attentive quiet. "So look for it," Dr. Ewan said simply. "Always look for it." Dominic sat in the back row and looked at the room and thought about Mrs. Rosa Alvarez, 81 years old, in a Brooklyn building, who had taught a signal to a hallway full of kids one summer because a girl 3 blocks over went missing. He thought about Ms. Brennan, who had taught it every year for 6 years without knowing if it would ever matter. He thought about Emma raising that small fist on a rainy sidewalk and trusting the world to see her. He thought about how long a thing has to travel before it lands in the right place. After the assembly, as the children were filing out, Ms. Brennan caught his eye from across the room and gave him a small nod. Not effusive, just acknowledging. The nod of one person to another who understood the full weight of a moment without needing to perform the understanding. He nodded back. He was almost to the gymnasium door when he heard his name. Not his last name, just Mr. The same word she'd used on the sidewalk. The same voice, though it was less whisper now and more steady. He turned around. Emma stood about 10 feet away. She had separated from her class line. He could see her teacher letting it happen, giving them space with the deliberate tact of an adult who knew when to step back. Emma stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him the way she had on the sidewalk, with that same clear-eyed, calculating assessment, like she was deciding how much of what she saw she could trust. Then she walked toward him. He stayed where he was, let her close the distance on her terms. She stopped about 2 feet away, tipped her head back to look up at him. He was a tall man, and she was a small person, and neither of them seemed bothered by this. "I knew you came," she said. "I saw you when I sat down." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "You didn't look back." "I didn't need to look back," she said with the specific confidence of a child who has decided something and finished deciding it. "I could tell." He looked at her. "How did you know it was me?" Emma considered this seriously, the way she seemed to consider most things. "Because you sat in the back," she said, "and you didn't talk to anyone, and you watched everything." She paused. "That's how you looked on the sidewalk too, like you were watching everything and most people couldn't tell." Something in him went very still. "I was afraid," Emma said. It came out matter of fact. Not confessional, not dramatic, just honest, the way children are honest when they've decided honesty is the correct tool for the moment. "That day, I was really scared." "I know," he said, "but I did the signal anyway." She looked at him steadily. "Because my teacher said someone would see it, and I decided to believe her." A pause. "Was that dumb?" "No," he said. That was the smartest thing I've ever seen anyone do. Emma absorbed this with a small nod, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. My mom says you helped with other stuff too. After. She didn't tell me everything, but she said there were other kids. She watched his face. Were there? He held her gaze. Yes. Did they get home okay? One of them did, he said, because of what you started. Emma blinked, just once. Then she looked down at her shoes for a moment, and when she looked back up, something had shifted in her face. Not sadness, not the weight of consequence, but a kind of grave and serious understanding that sat unusually well on an 8-year-old's features, like she was trying the understanding on and finding it fit. My teacher says the signal saved my life, Emma said. But I think you saved my life, because the signal only works if someone sees it. He didn't respond to that immediately. He thought about Doctor. Ewan saying exactly that to the room full of children an hour ago. The signal only works if someone knows to look for it, and about how Emma had apparently already understood this independently, had worked it out in her own 8-year-old reasoning, and arrived at the right answer. We both did, he said. You made the signal. I looked. Neither of us saves anybody alone. Emma thought about this for a moment. Then she said, that's like a team. Yes, he said, exactly like a team. She seemed satisfied with this. She reached into the pocket of her blue sweater and took out something small, a folded piece of paper creased carefully into a tight square, the way children fold things they want to keep safe. She held it out to him. He took it, looked at her for permission. She nodded. He unfolded it. It was a drawing, crayon on white paper done with the focused imprecision of a child who was trying very hard. 2 figures, one small in what was clearly a yellow dress, and one tall in what was clearly a long dark coat. Between them, connecting them, a hand small lifted, with the thumb folded in. Under the drawing in careful printed letters, he didn't look away. Dominic looked at the drawing for a long moment. He didn't trust his voice immediately, which was a new experience. He had spent decades in rooms with dangerous people and maintained his voice without effort. An 8-year-old with a crayon had done something those rooms never managed. He folded the drawing back carefully along its original creases. Thank you, he said. He said it simply and meant it completely. Ma looked up at him. Are you going to be okay? She asked. The question caught him so off guard that for a moment he had no response at all. He had been asked this question before by his mother, occasionally by Gerald, in his roundabout professional way by Carver once years ago in the aftermath of something difficult. But he had not expected to be asked it here now by this particular person with this particular directness. What makes you ask that? He said. Emma shrugged, but it was a thinking shrug, not a dismissive one. My therapist says that when people do something hard and good, they sometimes feel weird after, like they don't know what to do next. She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. You looked like that, in the back row. He looked at her for a long moment. I think I'm going to be okay, he said. I'm working on it. Emma nodded, and in her nod was the complete acceptance of a child who knew that working on it was the most honest answer an adult could give, and respected it accordingly. Ms. Brennan appeared at Emma's shoulder, gentle but present. We need to get back to Class M. Emma turned to go, took 2 steps, stopped. She turned back one more time and looked at him with the same expression she'd had on the sidewalk, that final measuring decided look. Then she raised her right hand. Not the signal this time. Not the distress signal. Not the help signal. Not the gesture that had started everything 3 weeks ago on a rainy Manhattan block. Just a wave, small and deliberate. The same wave she'd given him from across the block while standing in the spill of a streetlight in her soaked yellow dress. He raised his hand in return, the same way he had then. She turned and walked back to her class and didn't look back again in Mezal. Brennan met his eyes briefly over Emma's head with an expression that was too full to categorize, and then she was gone too, and the gymnasium was emptying around him, and Dominic stood in the back of the room with a carefully folded piece of crayon paper in his hand and the particular clarifying quiet of a man who had just been seen clearly by someone with no reason to see him gently and every reason to be afraid of him. He walked back to his car. He sat in it for a moment without starting it, put the drawing in the inner pocket of his coat against his chest, felt the slight weight of it there, almost nothing, the weight of one piece of paper, and felt it anyway. He thought about all of it, the whole shape of it. A rainy evening in a yellow dress and a signal raised for 2 seconds in a crowd, and everything that had moved outward from that moment like rings spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Sandra Cho in a courtroom steady. Maya Ruiz home in Trenton with her mother. 4 community centers, a curriculum, hundreds of children learning to raise their hand. Gary Foltz in a federal facility counting 14 years. A federal network dismantled its records, seized its members, charged the slow machinery of consequence, finally turning in the right direction. And here in this parking space, a man who had spent the better part of his adult life operating in the dark, holding a child's drawing against his chest and understanding for the first time in longer than he could measure that the darkness was not the only thing he was made of. He started the car. He drove back to his office, went upstairs, sat at his desk, opened his laptop, pulled up the file he'd been building on the curriculum expansion, not the 4 centers in New York, but the next phase, 8 more cities. Dr. Ewan had sent him preliminary data the day before on schools in Chicago, Houston, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, where the program could be implemented with relatively modest funding and significant impact. He had been looking at the numbers for 3 days without pulling the trigger. He pulled up the email draft he'd been sitting on, read it once, sent it. Dr. Ewan's response came back in 11 minutes, which told him that she'd been waiting for it. It said, "I'll have implementation plans for all 8 cities on your desk by Monday." "Thank you. This matters more than you know," he typed back. "I think I'm starting to understand how much." He set the laptop aside and looked at the window. The city moved below him the way it always moved, without pausing, without acknowledging him, without caring what he'd done, or what he was doing, or what he intended to do next. The city was indifferent. That was its nature, and also, in a specific way, its gift. It asked nothing of him, which meant everything he gave was a choice. He had spent most of his life choosing power, choosing control, choosing the version of safety that came from being the most dangerous thing in any room. Those choices had served him, and they had cost him, and he understood both of those things clearly. But 3 weeks ago, on a rainy sidewalk, he had made a different kind of choice. A smaller one on the surface, just a decision not to keep walking, not to look away from a small frightened face in a crowd. And that small choice had moved through the world like a signal moves through a crowd, outward branching, finding people and changing things in ways he could only partially see and would never fully know. He reached into his coat pocket and took out Emma's drawing, unfolded it again, set it flat on the desk in front of him, looked at the 2 crayon figures and the hand between them and the careful printed letters. He didn't look away. She had drawn it as a statement of fact, not a compliment, not flattery, just a simple, accurate record of a thing that had happened to man who, in one moment that mattered, had looked at her instead of away from her, and because of that, everything else had been possible. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a small frame he'd bought 2 days ago, not knowing entirely why, just knowing, and put the drawing in it. Set it on the corner of his desk where he would see it every day in every meeting, in every conversation, in negotiation, in decision that came through his office and whatever came next. Not as a reminder of what he'd done, as a reminder of what was always possible. That on any ordinary rainy evening, in any ordinary crowd, one person choosing to see another person clearly could start something that moved through the world in ways no one could predict or contain or fully account for. That signal and witness together could change everything. That once, if it landed right, was always enough. Dominic Reyes sat at his desk with a child's drawing framed in the corner of his vision, and the city alive and indifferent below him, and understood with the same certainty he had always applied to the things he decided to believe, that he was not the same man who had stepped out of a black car on a rainy November evening 3 weeks ago. He was not going back to being that man. And he was not going to waste what Emma had without knowing it, given him the proof delivered by 8 years of courage and a single raised hand that the most dangerous thing in a room was not always the most powerful one. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room was the person who refused to look away. He had been that person once. He intended to keep being that person for a very long time.